Folklore is the 8th studio album from pop behemoth Taylor Swift, actually dropping as a surprise album, I believe the first surprise album of her career, and recorded in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. As soon as we heard word of this album, it was pretty clear immediately that this was going to be something very different for Taylor Swift fans, from the stark black and white album cover to its surprise release, the fact it's called Folklore, how long it is, and the collaborators she was working with as well. Most of the album is produced in collaboration with the National's Aaron Dessner. Folklore is very stripped back and subtle, especially in comparison to her last album, Lover, which dropped, I think, not even a year ago now. I think it was last summer. I think the album art does a perfect job of accurately capturing the mood of this album. It's very, very somber at times. It's dreary. Well, for a Taylor Swift album, at least, it's very dreary. It's very melancholic and it's very nostalgic. Shifting away from the overblown, bombastic, traditional pop of the last album and the album that preceded it, this is something very different. The album is characterized by a lot of subtle piano work, some subtle strings as well, very, very moody, kind of in the background, loose percussion elements as well. And there's also a strong emphasis on meshing elements of organic live instrumentation with some more electronic sequence elements. And that is apparent on the opening song, which is The One, which is built around some simple piano work with some subtle sequence percussion. The songwriting kind of sets the mood for the rest of the album, but it kind of does fit more in her traditional wheelhouse than the rest of the album might suggest. What I do like most about this song is the kind of self-empowerment, nostalgic, and very, very vivid, descriptive songwriting in the song, which carries throughout most of the rest of the album. One thing I did notice when I first heard Folklore is that I found myself having a similar reaction or initial reaction to when I listened to Lana Del Rey's last album, which dropped last year, Norman fucking Rockwell. It's hard not to look past the very, very strong Lana Del Rey influence on a lot of the album. And I think that is the most apparent on what's turned out to be the first single on the album, which is Cardigan. Again, it's very nostalgic. It seamlessly meshes elements of autobiographical storytelling with some fictional elements. It's similar in style to the opening song, with a bit more flair and subtlety, in my opinion. And the kind of subtle creeping strings that come in the second half of the song, I think, is a nice touch as well. What I do really, really love about this song is I love the idea and the concept of paralleling the idea of a long-lost love and mythology, and those ideas kind of inhabiting the same space in your mind. That emphasis on nostalgia and not necessarily a longing for the past, but looking back on the past with a kind of bittersweet screen in front of you is probably best exemplified by the song Seven. Seven maybe has my favorite vocal performance on the entire album. I love the way the subtly strung guitars kind of creep in, as well as some swelling strings, and the kind of loose, rustic, echoey percussion going on distantly in the background as well. It's a kind of beautiful, but again, bittersweet mesh of childlike wonder colliding quite violently with a harsh reality. I think it's one of the more sophisticated moments of songwriting on the entire album. And also Taylor's falsetto towards the end of the song is, quite frankly, beautiful. This album is called Folklore for a reason. There's a lot of stress on telling these fictional or true stories and relating them back to Taylor's personal life, which is what she does on The Last Great American Dynasty. Once again, she's meshing organic elements with some subtle electric sequence elements, while she's telling the story of a woman whose name I believe is Rebecca Harkness, whom I had never heard of and whose story I've learned through this song. There's a very strong emphasis in the song on empowerment and female empowerment specifically, and also recognizing the very, very sexist society that this character, Rebecca Harkness, lived in, as well as realizing the reality that some of those sexist ideas have not just disappeared with time. I do love the way the song ends poetically with Taylor coming into possession of Rebecca's old house that she'd lived in. What I think is Taylor at her most vulnerable and honest and open on this album is on the song This Is Me Trying. This Is Me Trying is a very honest, self-critical dissection of her own flaws and mistakes that she's made in past relationships. I think it's an extremely mature song. It's the most chamber pop-esque song, if you can call it that, especially with all the kind of Baroque infused strings going on in the background, the very, very echoey, spacey vocals. It kind of reminds me of a singer in the vein of like a Julia Holter. I think we hit a highlight early on in the tracklist with the song Exile, which is a duet with Justin Vernon of Bon Iver. The song depicts these two former lovers kind of witnessing the other just after a kind of tumultuous breakup. Justin Vernon is singing in a much lower register than we're used to hearing him, of course stripped of his kind of strange idiosyncratic auto-tune. He's playing this character who's so petty and bitter over this breakup, and he can't quite move on, and he's angry about how quickly his partner has moved on from their relationship. And then Taylor's character offers the flip side of this. Her character's kind of disturbed by how Justin Vernon's character is viewing her new lover, and how Justin Vernon's character has failed to recognize that their relationship is kind of doomed from the start. I think it's quite a tragic song as well, because I empathize with both of these characters, but I think you have to empathize a bit more with Taylor's character, because she's been kind of put into this false sense of security of being in a loving relationship. And it's as soon as she's moved on, she's looked back and realized that this was all a facade. But what I find the most kind of dark and depressing and tragic is that she's in this new relationship where that cycle could easily just start all over again. Instrumentally, the song is very, very sparse. It's backed by yet another simple piano melody with some dramatic strings becoming more prominent as the song goes on. One more thing I love about this song is I love how the back and forth between these two ex-lovers kind of plays out like a futile argument. At one point, Justin Vernon's character says, "You never gave any signs," and then Taylor Swift's character says, "So many signs," and it kind of like their vocals cascade over each other as they're having this essentially pointless argument. What makes the song ultimately tragic is that it has no resolution to it. For as many highlights as this album has, it does kind of lose momentum towards like the last third of the album, I think. Mad Woman is a song I think lacks a little bit of focus, especially in comparison to some of the better songs on the album. I think if someone was making the argument that some of this album is a bit copying Lana Del Rey's whole aesthetic and vocal delivery and songwriting techniques, this is the song that you would point to, because at times Mad Woman does sound like a not as good impression of Lana Del Rey. There's very few low points in the album for me, but I think the one genuinely low point for me was the song Epiphany. I think the vocal delivery is kind of bizarre, and I think both musically and from a songwriting perspective, the song kind of goes nowhere. Thankfully, this is an exception rather than the rule. Most of the songs on here are very engaging. They're very beautifully written. They're very tastefully done as well. I think what's dangerous, or what's risky even, not dangerous, what's risky with an album like this and someone like Taylor is that if you make such a sharp left turn, you can kind of alienate your core fan base. And she has kept most of the core elements to what makes a Taylor Swift song a Taylor Swift song. A song like August, I think, is a perfect mesh of these two styles that she's trying to combine. It's a bit more overtly dramatic than a lot of the songs on the album. It's a bit more bombastic. The production is a bit more in your face, but it still has that kind of cozy, intimate, rustic aesthetic to it. I appreciate how willing someone of Taylor Swift's stature is to try and reinvent her sound this deep into her career. And there are moments on the album that do sound like she's genuinely taking some bold risks. And I think the song Mirrorball is a good example of that. I think this is the song that takes a number of cues from a number of different genres. I think the vocal delivery specifically of the song is very unique, but it works for me. It's a very open and honest and thought-provoking song, I find. What I feel the song is about is how hard it can be to distinguish you adapting in a positive way, adapting to your surroundings and just fundamentally changing who you are and what makes you you. And I think that's a perfect metaphor for what this album is. Taylor she's adapting. She's not necessarily abandoning what makes her her and what makes Taylor Swift, but she's changing with the times, and I think that's important for any artist that wants to grow. The album ends in a very dark manner with the song Hoax, actually. It's a very depressing description of a very, very unhealthy relationship. And again, it's one of those things where someone like Taylor Swift, who has built her name on a certain kind of sound, for her to end an album in such a depressing way is a bold risk for someone in her position. I do think Folklore is easily her strongest album to date. Personally, I've been quite hot and cold with some of her music over the past few years. I did really enjoy 1989, which was, 5-6 years ago now. I enjoyed a couple of songs off Red, but some of her later albums I found to be a bit iffy, especially Reputation. I thought that was very, very under par, because I can see the talent that Taylor Swift has at her disposal. But I thought that was a bit rushed, a bit lazy. I thought Lover was a bit of a return to form for her, but again, I don't think that album justified how long it was, especially in comparison to this album. I love seeing artists, no matter how big they are and how successful they are, that are willing to take risks, willing to possibly lose some of their fan base in the pursuit of something different, something bigger, something greater. Those are my thoughts on the album. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought. Make sure to like, subscribe, and dong the bell, and I will see you next time.